We'll introduce Matthew, of course. Matthew Paterson is a professor of international politics at the University of Manchester and research director of Sustainable Consumption Institute. His research focuses on the political economy of global environmental change. His publications include Global Warming and Global Politics, Automobile Politics that was published in 2007, Climate Capitalism, Global Warming and the Transformation of the Global Economy, which he wrote with Peter Novel in 2010, and Transnational Climate Change Governance with Harriet Bulkeley and 8 others that was published in 2014. He's currently focused on the political economy and cultural politics of climate change and starting to work on the networked character of global climate governance. The topic today is the centrality of politics to climate change and the problem of climate. So I will let you start, Matthew.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. I hope I make it worthwhile. There are lots you'll see. I was in for the last sort of 15 minutes of the previous session, so you'll see lots of commonalities, but I won't address them directly, but feel free to raise them in the questions. I want to do sort of 3 things in the talk today. And those all connect also to this is a blatant plug, and I apologize, a book that I have coming out in August later this year called In Search of Climate Politics, a subject I've been working on for 30 years, but I decided it was time to try and make a sort of general statement about this. So the 3 things I want to do is, one is to persuade you that climate change is intrinsically political, if you have tendencies to think that it might not be. I think that from the chat in the previous message, some of you maybe already do think of it will, but some of you may not. So I'll do that. The other thing I want to, the second thing I want to do is to talk about that problem, in particular in the context of large-scale assessments of climate change, such as the IPCC. And like Christian Gollier, I was a lead author in the IPCC report for 2014. We actually met at a meeting in New Zealand, which is the picture behind me, probably in about 2012. And so I want to talk a bit about the problem of thinking about politics in the context of those sorts of institutionalized processes. Sorry, my computer is doing something funny, so I apologize for that. And the third thing I want to do is then to sort of spell out a little bit what I mean by how climate change is political. So those are the 3 sorts of things I want to do. So to start, this is an image from a protest in Brussels that periodically gets, you will see occasionally in newspaper reports and media reports about climate change, especially with the protest on. And here what you have is the slight oddity of a protester holding up a banner saying climate first, politics second. And this seems to me to be, as a political scientist, rather ironic and odd in the sense that this person is engaging in political action over climate change while rhetorically saying that we need climate change not to be political, right? And you will see other versions of that amongst social movements and protest politics. The organization Extinction Rebellion, which started in the United Kingdom but has offshoots all around the world. One offshoot of that now in the UK is called has created a political party called the Beyond Politics Party, which is, to my mind, the extreme of that sort of level of irony. So what's going on when you've got people involved in climate action, climate political action, protest action, that at the same time want to say something along the lines of, let's keep the politics out of climate change. So we see this urge to depoliticize, to say it's not political or take it out of the political arena in other ways as well, not just in protest movements, but also in the public media. Here's a few examples from the Ottawa Citizen, from Inside Climate News, which is a climate-specific news site, and others, more PBS at the bottom as well, where the tagline is always going to be some variant of keep or take or otherwise, get rid of the politics of climate change. And lots of you may have this urge as well when you look at climate action. There was discussions of carbon pricing in Canada at the end of the previous session, for example, where you want to sit there and say, oh, this is just these politicians squabbling and we need to get them out of the way. And we also see this in, if you like, the production of knowledge. So the sort of theme of the summer school as a whole, cognitive challenges of climate change. We will see lots of sort of claims to about climate change that suggest that it is intrinsically either not political or should not be political, right? Either an empirical claim or a normative claim, right? So, and I'm being, almost straw person simplistic to make these points really, really super clear. So, for example, you will have some economists, I don't think Christian Gollier, and certainly not all economists, who will say, all you need is a carbon price and then everything will magically fall into place. And I use the word magically deliberately, maybe to be provocative, but I think the idea, but it is the case, I think, the idea that you will only get to the sorts of transformations we need via carbon pricing and carbon pricing will be both necessary and sufficient to get to those transformations, I think, is a sort of magical thinking. You will have others, for example, saying, all you need is some fantastic technological breakthrough, and we will get there. The Bill Gates quote that you've got on the screen now is a good example of that, but you have institutes like the Breakthrough Institute for whom that is the case, where they just say, we need battery life will save us, lithium will save us, thorium will save us, etc. Nuclear will save us, whatever the technology is preferred, but it's a sort of technology will save us story, a single cause. Or you will have some, maybe fewer in number, but nevertheless periodically saying it's simply a question of population, get human numbers down and we'll magically solve the problem. All of these, I think, are examples of that sort of urge to suggest that climate change is not, in fact, a problem, not a political question, but that's a question of technology or prices or population. But you also get moves like this which say, well, even when there is politics, we need to actually depoliticize it. So, for example, on the bottom right, you've got an argument that has been made in the European context, but occasionally you've seen it made at the global context, to say we actually need some sort of equivalent of a central bank for money. We need an equivalent to that for carbon, which is taken out of the political realm entirely. That's right, say the politicians don't get even to decide how much carbon should be reduced, but that should be done by some sort of technical body like an independent central bank. Even more extreme, and this is James Lovelock, very well-known environmental scientist over the years, arguing explicitly recently that actually we need to just get rid of democracy and that democracy is the problem. So, or otherwise put, politics is the problem, and that we need to sort of go to some sort of authoritarian system where we get rid of all of this squabbling. So those are various sites at which we see sort of anti-political or depoliticizing arguments, either saying that climate change is not political, or it should not be political, one version of those. The question then, I think, that to ask ourselves is what is meant by the word politics in all of those arguments, right? So we can see, for example, politics is some sort of noise that intrudes into the normal working of things, right? So we have some nice, neat economic model of the world, and then suddenly you get this messy stuff where elections come in the way, or you get these irrational populist politicians coming in, pronouncing on climate denial and so on, that somehow get in the way of a rational way of dealing with climate change. Another way that politics sort of figures in some of these sort of arguments is, and there's a well-known literary critic that I'm paraphrasing here called Terry Eagleton, who said in a different context, but we can think of sort of politics is like halitosis, bad breath. It's what the other guy has. So you'll often, for example, if you think in the Canadian context over the politics of pipelines, you will get a Conservative politician or a Liberal politician or an NDP politician often saying you shouldn't play politics with Canadians' lives, and that's not only over climate change. You'll hear that about health policy, or also you'll hear that in the pandemic, for example. Shouldn't play politics with people's lives, but there, of course, what's going on is simply saying I'm not playing politics, even though I am Justin Trudeau or whoever, Stephen Harper or whoever. Sorry, that's a anachronistic use of Canadian politicians, but you know what I mean, that it's somebody from one side saying the other person is doing the politics, but actually it's fairly transparent that Trudeau or Harper or whoever is themselves engaging in politics by doing that. Thirdly, I think there's a sense very clearly in all of these rhetorical devices that politics is a bad thing. It's something to be avoided, right? It's something that gets in the way, makes things worse, and so on. And maybe at the root of all of these different points is a sense that politics is it's an old-fashioned English word of politicking. It's almost like not really been used since the 18th century, but it's this sort of petty pursuit of power for individual specific interests, the jostling of position to gain the fruits of public office, right? So those are the sort of senses of the word politics that are embedded in these claims that we need to take the politics out of climate change, right? And what I want to suggest to you, that's a really superficial account of politics, and we need a much richer one to be able to think more carefully about why climate change is intrinsically political and we can't avoid it, and that we have to go beyond these sort of superficial accounts. Those of you who've done a bit of a, if you can remember back to some time where you maybe did a Political Science 101 course many years ago, some of you may have done a whole political science degree, I don't know, but you might well have had some course where you've thought about this more carefully, but it may well be a number of years since you've done that. So what should we understand by politics, and therefore build our understanding of climate change from that? There are three, I think, more adequate, general, academically rigorous accounts of what we mean when we use the word politics. They articulate with those more superficial accounts. They can incorporate them in some way, but they're a bit more systematic, a bit more rigorous, and a much more useful basis thinking about climate change and its politics. The first of these is to understand that politics, or think about politics as an arena. That is to say, it's the sites of and the institutions of key collective authoritative decision-making. So if you like, the underlying logic is we live in large complex societies. We have evolved institutions that make decisions on our behalf, that it's almost unimaginable, that only the most diehard anarchist might suggest that we can live without those institutions. And that therefore there is something irreducible of the existence of processes and sites and the rules and norms that underpin those by which we make collective decisions that govern our lives. The second is a use of the term politics as what gets called a process, right? And here the key thing here is that when political scientists talk about politics as a process, we're thinking about relations of power. That is to say, we live in worlds not only that are large complex societies, but we live in worlds which are structured in some way with some people or some organizations having more power than others, and people standing in some sort of power relationship to each other, whether those are relations to do with the workplace and the economy, right? Power relations in the workplace, power relations through the use of physical force, military relations, relations of violence of various sorts, and so on, or the control over specific types of resources, money, material resources, and so on. All of those are relations of power that are themselves political. So wherever there is power, there is politics in that sense. In that sense, politics is not reducible from that point of view to simply a simple arena. We can't say politics is just about the government. Politics is going on in various aspects of social life, in universities, in the family, in all sorts of workplaces, and so on, that we have to think about. And thirdly, there is a sort of debate amongst political scientists about whether we think about politics in terms of conflict or of consensus. So there are some, for example, who would argue that, properly speaking, politics only occurs when people are seeking to find agreement amongst themselves. And conversely, you will have others who will insist just as assertively that actually it's only political where we've got this moment of conflict where a decision has to be made to resolve that in some way. I would tend to think that it's more intrinsically conflictual than it is consensual as a dynamic, but that's a slightly less important distinction and decision to make. But however, the final point to make about these three is that these are different conceptions of politics, but it's not particularly useful to think of them, to try and decide which one is the best conception of politics, but rather to think that actually when we talk about politics in everyday life and academically, we're actually using some mix of all three of these conceptions. And what becomes important, especially when we think about climate change, or maybe not especially, but when I think about climate change as political, what we see going on is often about the interaction between these three, right? The intrusion of the relations of power into the institutions of decision-making, for example. But whatever we think about that particular last point, the point then to underscore is that politics is not noise. We can't wish it away. It's embedded in everything we do, not just the government, but everything indeed right down to daily life. And it also isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? How politics works can actually create huge sorts of effects. The fact that we have a welfare state in lots of Western democracies, the fact that we have democracy in the first place is a product of politics. And so there's lots of positive things that we can be seeking political systems and political processes to achieve for us in relation to climate change. Right. So why does this matter in relation to understanding climate change? So if we think about it as politics as arena, the first point, the most basic point to make, if you like, is that it's these key decision-making sites, which can be governments at various levels, right? From, obviously in federal context, like in Canada, those could be states. Those could be the federal government. Those could be provinces. They could also be municipal levels, all the way up to the global levels. Some of these decision-making sites are not necessarily states, though. We've got lots of private sector organisations or NGOs trying to make rules about climate change. I don't have time to go into the details about that, but if you want me to talk about that, I can. And these are the key sites of decision-making that will enable, incentivise or force decisions about investment, technology or consumption. Some of the policy tools that Christian Gaulier was talking about in the previous session will be some of these effects, but the ability to make any of those policies stick will depend on the politics of how those arenas work and how that sort of competition and decision-making goes on. The complicating factor, of course, is that many of these sites are historically also the sites where key decisions have been made that have created the high carbon world that we live in. Just to take one very brief example, right? One of the early sites of, if you think about back to the first part of the 20th century, right? What Anthropocene writers call the Great Acceleration, of the massive expansion of greenhouse gases and a range of other ecological impacts as well, social and ecological impacts as well. After the Second World War, lots of the decisions that made that were made by governments to engage in warfare in novel ways. So shortly before the First World War, the British military establishment under the Minister Winston Churchill, who was the Minister of War at that point, in 1913, I think, just before the First World War, made a decision to shift the the British Navy, which was still comfortably the largest navy in the world, to shift over the source of operations from coal and steam to oil. And that had various strategic advantages for the operations of the British Navy and helped its dominance during the First World War over the German Navy in particular. But that also, of course, was part of setting in train a huge range of investments in oil in the Middle East and a whole set of things that have followed from that. And you could think of other examples where key government decision-making have had the effect of accelerating the consumption of oil, coal, and gas, the key three fossil fuels. So that complicates it, right? Can the same types of institutions that have generated the high carbon world also be the ones that generate the low carbon or zero carbon world that we need to be transforming towards? But nevertheless, we can think of politics arena, whether you're going to try and accelerate a new technology, whether you want to get carbon prices right, whether you want to shift investment into renewables and energy efficiency and all of the other things, low carbon cement, to take another example Christian Gaulier was talking about. All of those decisions are ones that are made by these authoritative actors, mostly governments, but not absolutely exclusively governments. If we think of politics as power, then we're talking about this sort of, we can think very clearly about the ability of some actors to either force or block climate action as key to explaining why, on the one hand, why climate action has been weak so weak to date, and on the other hand, what form of climate action has taken when it has occurred. So in terms of the first of these, right, climate action has been very weak, and that we know that there's been very extensive systematic lobbying by actors that benefit from the existing fossil fuel dominated energy system, who have been very successful, more successful in some countries than others. It's not a universal sort of, all states are the same in this regard, but nevertheless, if we want to answer why we have not decarbonised so far in the 30 years that climate change has been high on the policy agenda, then the lobbying efforts of coal companies, oil companies, steel, car manufacturers, and so on, is a very significant part of that explanation. But we can also think, if you like, more qualitatively, if we look at what types of policies have been adopted, then this also helps us explain some of that sort of dynamic. So, for example, in terms of the carbon pricing that Christine Gollier was talking about earlier on, then there are two broad forms of this, right? Carbon taxes and cap and trade systems. For the most part, Canada is actually slightly an outlier in this regard, certainly with British Columbia carbon tax, and then some carbon taxes imposed by the federal government on provinces that haven't wanted to do their own carbon pricing systems. Then for the most part, the choice between that has been cap and trade over carbon taxes. Carbon taxes are really rare. Cap and trade systems are now quite widespread. They may not be adequate in terms of the price they generate or how strict they are, but nevertheless, they are relatively widespread now across the world. And one of the explanations for that, certainly if you look at the European system, is that the beneficiaries of a cap and trade system in terms of specific actors include the financial sector. The banks and financial institutions have made significant amounts of money out of carbon trading directly, and some of the people, leading countries within the European Union, for example, on carbon trading, ironically now the UK was very much a leading force in that in the 2000s, in the late 1990s and the 2000s, did so because they thought they knew that there was a benefit to the financial sector from that particular sort of policy design. Right? So the shape of climate policy is determined in part by the power of actors to get benefits for themselves. And in terms of the fossil fuel corporations, again, there's this large history, right? Those companies stretching back to the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century, and the shift over to coal and steam in industrial manufacturing, the emergence of railways and so on, have meant that many of the largest companies in the global economy, up until very recently, and in some senses still, have become an integral part of the development of societies, and very powerful within those. And the third, if we think about the third aspect of politics in terms of conflict, then one argument can be made. This is a slightly more difficult argument to sustain, so I don't know if I'll make this as, or it's not quite as straightforward as the other one, is the argument that most governments most Western governments in particular, have sought to pursue climate policy through consensual means. They've sought to have bipartisan support across party lines in countries like Canada is a very good example of this. And that the pursuit of that sort of consensus has often been undermined, either because you get some other party refusing to play the consensual game, Conservative Party in Canada, or the Republicans in the United States, or the National Liberals in Australia, are all good examples of this, or because actually that pursuit of consensus has meant that those incumbent actors, what we call incumbent actors, so fossil fuel corporations that are already dominant within the energy system, actually manage then to use that pursuit of consensus to undermine and water down the policy as it gets made. And that climate policy has been moved more often This is this is not a universal claim, but a move often being moved when protest or other social movement activism has shifted the power relations. So if we think about divestment movements, some of you may have been involved in campaigns on the campuses. Some of those of you who are students anyway, may have been involved in campaigns to get your university to divest from fossil fuels. And those sorts of campaigns have shifted, never quite as much as we might want, but they've opened up the policy space. The Extinction Rebellion protests, or the Schools for Climate, the Greta Thunberg-led climate strikes movements are other good examples where, in some countries, not everywhere, those have been moments which have forced governments to actually become more ambitious. So conflict is good from that point of view, or can be good from that point of view for climate action. Okay, so that's the first part of what I wanted to talk about. Then the second point is then to talk about this as a bit shorter, specifically in the context of these large-scale exercises to assess climate change. And I'm going to talk a bit about the IPCC. Like I said earlier on, I was involved in the last report. I'm a little bit involved in the current report, but not as directly. Now, the IPCC was established in 1988, towards the end of 1988, to provide what is its mantra: policy relevant, not policy prescriptive knowledge about climate change. And so the IPCC is governed as an intergovernmental body, which then commissions a report from scientists worldwide of various sorts, natural scientists, social scientists, and so on, across the world, where it produces a report every 6-7 years or so, to sort of provide the state of the art of knowledge about climate change. It's organized into 3 working groups. Each working group then has a set of underlying chapters which are extensively reviewed, including by governments, who get to sort of line by line comment on specific things said in that report, in those chapters. And then there's a summary for policymakers and a synthesis report, which is drafted by the author team, the scientists, but it's then line edited by governments. So essentially it's written by, the final version is formally approved by governments. Now the IPCC, and I'm going to come back to some of the implications of that in a minute. The IPCC has had a series of recurrent legitimacy crises prompted by, among other things, on the one hand, it needs to get global buy-in, right? It's a global body, it's a UN body, and North-South issues in particular have been quite prominent, partly, of course, because the North-South inequalities also map onto the North-South inequalities in expertise. And so the numbers of authors, if you have a report written solely by Western scientists, lots of policymakers in countries in the global South might be rather skeptical about it, for hopefully fairly obvious reasons. The second legitimacy crisis has been produced by explicit attacks on the IPCC by climate deniers over the years. ClimateGate from 2008-9 was one of the most prominent of these, but there have been various other ways that climate deniers have attacked IPCC. And also, I think more generally by the fact that even if the IPCC's participants don't want to present what they do as political, the fact is it's producing reports that say, if we are going to meet, let's say, a 1.5 or a 2 degree target, we have to wean ourselves off fossil fuels by 2050, roughly. That's the net zero carbon emissions claim from the 1.5 report of 4 years ago. And I'm sure you've had that mentioned elsewhere in this summer school, so I don't need to belabor that. But that's anybody who knows that, any policymaker, any government bureaucrat who sees that, knows that's got huge political implications, right? To transition our societies away from fossil fuels has huge implications for how we live, who benefits, who makes money from what, and so on. Even if the IPCC doesn't have to say it's political, but all the policymakers who have to approve the report know that it is. And you know that's all governments of the world, right? So this government report is going to be also approved by the government of Saudi Arabia, who has very obvious interests in not transitioning the world away from fossil fuels. So in that context, then when I've been involved as a political scientist, and others, I'm not the only one involved as well, in the context of the IPCC process, the obvious question we want to talk about now is how do we talk about and analyze and discuss and assess why some countries have got emissions under control, not adequately, there isn't a single country that's got an adequate climate policy, but nevertheless the variation between the two countries that I hold a passport in, the UK and Canada, for example, where UK emissions are currently down about 40%, and Canadian emissions are, well, shall we just say not down by anything like that amount, in fact still higher than they were in 1990, if I don't have the latest figure in my head. How do we talk about, we might want to learn something from that variation, right? And that might be something to do with the policy dynamics in different countries, how those policies are made, how the politics as arena, power and conflict have operated in those three countries, might explain a lot of that difference. But of course the audience, i.e. the governments, have a rather vested interest in the answer to this question. And they'd really rather that we, the scientists, didn't ask that question. But it seems to me, a rather important one. So, for example, lots of other NGOs produce rankings like this. Now, I don't think there's any suggestion that the IPCC authors would ever produce some sort of authoritative ranking of countries, but nevertheless, we do. This is an NGO one, and this is just G20 countries. You can see Canada down near the bottom there, and you can see the UK at the top, reflecting largely the different trajectories of their emissions. But there is something to learn from that variable performance that it would be useful for a large-scale assessment of climate change action to engage in, but the IPCC makes that extraordinarily difficult to do. So that's the second point, and I'm happy to sort of, again, take questions on that if people want to talk about the IPCC in particular. The third point I've got, where am I? Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Wrong arrow. So that's the third point I wanted to talk about, is then if we think about, if I've done so far, if you like, what's in the top left-hand corner of this figure. And this figure is back to my the self-promotion alert, right? This is from the book that's coming out later in the year. So I've sort of spelled out what I think we can usefully think about how we can usefully conceptualize politics, but we obviously want to go a bit beyond that and say, well, what drives the politics of decision-making over climate change? I want to do two things here, really, just speaking from this figure, right, to spell out what's going on in this figure. The first, which is up on the right-hand side, is to ask the question, what political dynamics drive action and block action on climate change? And I want to say that my answer to that question is, at a general level, is two intertwined dynamics, which I've called there for shorthand accumulation and subjectivity. And this is broadly within what I would call a cultural political economy perspective. So I'm going to try and unpack briefly what that means. So on the one hand, if we look at the origins of why we live in a high carbon world, it's reasonably clearly in relation to the particular patterns of accumulation or economic growth or over the last 200 years, right? That accumulation of capital has been both generated by and dependent upon the use of fossil fuels. It's still 80% of world energy use is essentially still fossil fuel driven. Pretty much everything that goes on in the global economy is dependent on energy in some way or another, directly or indirectly. And the quantitative expansion of the global economy maps reasonably well onto the quantitative expansion of energy use, the vast majority of which has been through fossil fuels. Right. We can say a bit more specifically about that, and I'd refer you to an utterly fantastic historical book called Fossil Capital by Andreas Malm. If you haven't come across it, it's an utterly great read, apart from anything else. And what Malm does is explores the origins of the shift from water power to coal and steam power in the cotton mills of Manchester and its immediate surroundings, including where I live, currently live. The town where I live has various of these mills, some of which have gone into disrepair, some of which have been refurbished for apartments and hipster bars. Now, what Malm does is says that we have a really conventional story from technology specialists or economists, again, slightly overgeneralizing about both of those groups of people, but nevertheless, which says that we might have an intuitive idea, for example, even without that disciplinary knowledge, of thinking that the reason that we shifted from water to coal was because coal was more efficient, or it was cheaper, or it could expand more quickly, or the water was getting scarce, or it was too intermittent to control. And he shows that all of those arguments fail. They are not true as an explanation for that transition. So the reason we went to coal from water power in those mills was because they served, if you like, the class interests of the mill owners most effectively, mostly to do with how labor is to be deployed. So just to give one example, there's various examples he gives in the book, and it is a fantastic book, so I recommend it. But we'll give one example. The key transition, so the steam engine, the patent was in 1784, I think the date was, James Watt's patent that becomes the basis for what's used in Industrial Revolution, the shift over to steam. It's not until the 1820s and 30s and 40s that you actually get a big shift towards coal. Much, much later. It's not something magically, oh, coal comes along and all the mill owners go, oh, it's fantastic, let's go to this. It's actually much later, and the key date is 1826. And what happens in 1826 is that the spinners in the mills, the people who are spinning the cotton, or control the machine spinning the cotton, go on strike. And the spinners are, if you like, the elite workers in the mills. They control the work process. And so after this strike, the mill owners get together and say, we've got to undermine the power of these spinners, because they're going to kill us if they can go on strike every time they don't like what we're doing. And so they develop a technology to automate spinning and undermine the power of the spinners. It turns out then that the technicalities of those spinning machines means that they work much better if you run it off a steam engine rather than off a water mill, right? So trying to control labor and accumulate capital more effectively is what drives that transition to coal. Now that's just one example. He gives various others, but that's a useful, I think, starting point for thinking that accumulation and the power dynamics of that are really important to understanding why we live in a high carbon world, and also therefore why, at least while we still live in a capitalist world, what has to drive the shift to a low carbon economy, right? It's not to say we can't shift to a low carbon economy, but it helps us understand what has to be done in order to do that. The other side of the picture, though, is that what I've called their subjectivity. Apologies for that fancy term if people have not come across it before. But if you like to say, it's not enough just to think about this sort of pure corporate / class dynamics of accumulation and the way, for example, that fossil fuel companies might be able to lobby the state. It's effectively to block climate action. It's also that many of the things that now constitute how capital accumulation works are in fact embedded in everything we do in our daily life, as consumers, as households, as workers, right? Somebody was talking in the chat in the previous one about, can't we now not fly to any of our conferences anymore? Some of us really like to go to conferences in person. We actually have emotion. I feel that totally. I'm a climate person, but I really want to hang around with my friends in conferences and talk to them and have a beer with them, right? I can't do that over Zoom. And so our subjectivities, the ways that we are in the world, are embedded. That's a rather specific one. Well, not just to academics, but anybody who travels for work. But if you think about how we move around on a daily basis in cars, even in public transport, what food we eat, what devices we have in our daily lives, all of this stuff that we use, all of it depends on energy. All of it provides a means by which we are rather ambivalent about a low carbon transition. So, for example, we can see lots of senses of, well, I don't really want to stop eating beef, or lamb, or I don't want to stop driving my car and get on a bike or on the tram or the bus. I want to keep flying to conferences, all of that stuff. It makes it intrinsically more cultural. So it's a cultural transformation as well as a political economic transformation. So that's my sort of pitch for why climate action, what the central responses to why climate action is really difficult, and also what we need to think about if we're trying to promote climate action in political terms. The second point, I'm keeping my eye on time, I think I'm okay for time, is that let me know if I'm getting things, but I think I'm okay. I think I'm going to be about right. The second type of political question I think we can usefully ask is, when we look at what happens on climate change, what are these recurring dynamics that we see? Things that are just patterns in political life. And I'm going to talk about two here. So these, what I'm calling at the bottom of the slide, processes in climate change, climate politics. One of these is a dynamic of depoliticization and repoliticization. So for lots of the reasons that I talked about right at the beginning of the talk, you can see why certain actors at least want to depoliticize climate change. And by which I mean, one version of that is to pretend it's not a political issue in the first place. I think the more common when we meet the word politicization is to say that we want to take it out, we want to take that decision making out of the politics as an arena. We want to, for example, to say, well, let the experts decide, for example, rather than democratically elected politicians. But often that's being done in relation to, if you like, when we think about politics as power, it's certain actors with certain sorts of power who want to take it out and make that decision made by experts because it suits their interests better, because it gets the public out of the way who might make things complicated and so on. So you get these recurring pressures to depoliticize climate that might not always be malign, right? It's not always, my point is not that's always a bad thing. There may be good reasons want to say, for example, in the UK, we have a thing called the Climate Change Act, which came in 2007. And that sets 5-year carbon budgets, and governments are forced by law to report periodically on and develop a new carbon budget with a view to saying, here's how we're going to end up at zero carbon by 2050. It was originally 80% cuts, it's now 100% cuts by 2050. And that, if you like, and then there's a climate change committee, which is this sort of arm's length government agency, which, if you like, reports on whether the government's on track or not. So that's a certain form of depoliticization of letting experts make not the formal decisions about policy, but it locks governments in, constrains them in some depoliticized way. So it's not always that depoliticization is a bad thing, but nevertheless, it's a recurring dynamic. On the other hand, we have a recurring dynamic of repoliticization. So, for example, some of the examples I've given of Extinction Rebellion or the school strikes or anti-oil pipe in Canada, maybe the oil pipeline protests are the really most prominent examples. Energy East is the one that was going to come through to you in Montreal, but Keystone XL or Northern Gateway and so on, where you get recurrent protests where people want to take this back into the public domain, back into explicit political debate and so on. And also they're usually doing that in order to contest the power of certain actors that they think are getting in the way. TransCanada or Suncor or whoever, in the case of the pipelines issue. And so on the one hand, you can see both of these things as recurrent dynamics. Every time governments successfully over time sort of keep it out of the sort of explicit political debate, over time you're going to get these protests erupting and so on that bring it back into that public debate. And that it's actually the dynamic between those which is actually quite useful for thinking about how climate action moves forward. The other sort of dynamic that is going on here, which is maybe less obvious what I mean by it, is purification versus complexity. So on the one hand, if you think about the oil pipeline activists, I'm going to put a couple of slides up here. This is one example. You may have seen a version of this map in different forms. this is a version, or you may have seen a slogan along the lines of somebody saying, there are 100 companies that cause 70% of world emissions. Right? This is a version which has the names of the CEOs of those companies and where they live, or where their companies are based. And so this is an example of what I would call purification, a radical claim that this is actually rather a simple problem. We just need to destroy the power of these companies and undermine them and expose them for what they are and regulate them out of existence. It makes it, so if you like, back into my cultural political economy, they're really focusing on the accumulation bit, but they're actually making that really simple. It's just about individual corporations, not the overall process of economic growth. And they're completely abstracting from the subjectivity point, right? The way that our lives are embedded in the things that those companies do, or even the accounting problem, right? So they're going to count, in the accounting to get to that number, they will sit there and say that every drop of oil that those of you who drive cars consume as actually accounted to one of these 100 companies, which seems to me immediately, obviously, radically simplistic. Nevertheless, it's been an extremely effective campaigning tool, right? If you think about divestment activists, they've been really, really good, really effective at using that sort of simplifying argument to identify the enemy as the fossil fuel corporations. If you think of an activist like Bill McKibben or Naomi Klein, they've been very, very good at naming the enemy, and it's been very politically effective, but it's got this rather distinct limit. On the other pole, what you've got is if you start to think about decarbonising cement and steel or meat or aviation, if we're going to have any aviation at all, or et cetera, what you've got is rather concrete, specific, technical, social, technical, economic problems that have to be governed, and policies have to be made to try and solve those issues. And they're really difficult to reduce to this purification. But on the other hand, if you don't think about the power dynamics, what you get is the simple technocracy, and that means that you don't get the sort of paying attention to those details. So these polls, yeah, I'm going to wrap up. This is my last point.
That was your cue.
that was it. See, last slide. So those are two recurring dynamics I would see. I can discuss examples of that if people want, but you probably, I hope you have examples in your head as I was talking that you could think about. So I hope this has been useful, interesting, and I look forward to your questions. I see lots of questions already in the chat, but I look forward to discussing those.